work? Yes. All right, looks like folks are still joining. I can't see if Mike's on the call.
I'm here. If you're
You're
talking
here,
about
yay.
Yep.
Cool. So Mike, you're our first agenda item. Do you want to take over the screen and share your slides, or you want me to run through them? I don't care either way.
I could do it. Scott Nicholas from my team is also joining us today.
Okay.
And we're both here to answer questions or talk through it. I think I have to set up sharing first. But if I share it, it's going to stop whoever's sharing right now.
Yeah, that's me. No problem.
Okay. Didn't want to be rude. Here we go. So we were asked to talk about community specifications today and how that might work in, oh, I don't have video on. There we go. How that might work in the Salsa model. And I think this is an easy way to structure a specification project. We came up with something with community specifications as a way to bridge the gap between what we were seeing, which is a lot of open source projects were trying to create specifications or standards, but there are certain requirements to have a legitimate standard and specification making process. When you talk about, especially potentially, if you wanted to, for example, make this an ISO recognized standard, then you would need to have followed certain practices in the creation of the standard. There's also aspects around licensing that are different in specifications. And so those were kind of the core tenets of why we created a community specification model. And really the goal here is to put in practice the correct or the appropriate standards making processes, and also put in the licensing changes that would be appropriate to developing a specification or standard. And what we do here is we go through a repository-based model for community specifications, where there is a repository. In fact, I'll stop sharing the screen and go to the community specs repo. This is a repo view. Any of our projects who use community specifications do, what they do is they fork this repo with all the files in it. And usually they put it into like a governance directory within their own repository, or as its own governance repo underneath an org. And it's meant to be GitHub friendly, GitHub developed. You can modify some of the files, like, for example, one of the ones that is common is like the governance file. But the main design goal here is to put the right things in place that are either required in most cases around the world by standards making efforts, or anybody who's going to recognize a standard, they're going to ask you to meet certain requirements. So the process and the openness of what you do in an open source project actually meets all of these requirements. It's just that in most open source projects are not documenting it in an appropriate way, such that it could be relied upon. So what we've done is try to make this simple for our project communities who want to do specifications or standards, so that they can just fork this into a repo, and in most cases just keep operating as they are today. When I look at what you have around contributing, none of this really needs to change. There's nothing here that is an issue or conflict with what we have. set up in the default for the community specifications work. Really, there are going to be some tweaks that we would recommend, but most of that would be around how to make this more configurable to what you're doing. And so what we have in the community specification is we have all of the terms, everything that you need. It's in the repository. You just need to clone that repository. The link is here, and I can also drop this. Or Scott, can you drop, or here, I'll drop it in the chat here as well so people can go take a look on their own. Nope, that didn't work.
I added the link to the meeting notes for people.
Oh, okay, for the meeting notes. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
And so really it's designed as a clonable repo. These are the files and what each of one of them is for. And so there's a getting started guide to help somebody who's taking this. And we didn't design this just for Linux Foundation projects, I should also state. We made this and designed it so that anybody could take it and create like a minimum viable specification project. And there are some other foundations I'm aware of who are already starting to use this as well. And we can, make this simple. So it literally would just be a pull request to pull these files in. The community specification license is a critical file here. The license is different on this. Again, there are differences in licensing between a specification and open source software code base. The code base is meant to license that particular code. The specification is meant to, and when they do an open source, when you make an open source contribution, almost all open source projects, you're making a contribution based on the code that you contribute. So if your organization's making a contribution, your organization's commitments are limited to what your organization is contributing. In a specification project, it's a little bit different because at the end, you want everybody to use the whole specification. You're maybe commenting on something, but maybe not making a pull request or a textual change or something like that. So the contribution commitments to a specification are against the entirety of the spec in almost all cases that I'm aware of. So what we try to do is just make it easy from a licensing perspective and make it also open source friendly so that the specification can then be implemented in an open source project. So that's the design goal around the license. You'll want your lawyers to review this and take a look at it if you're not familiar with it. The scope is probably the most important part, which is you define the scope, and we can just take this right from the current Salsa one, or you can adjust it accordingly in terms of what you have in your repo already. There's a template for any notices that might be required. That's the file number 3. There's a definition for the license for use in the code base. I forget what you have right now, but we would just make it that. Sorry if I'm just poking around here. I think you're using Apache 2. Yep, you have Apache 2. So that's simple. We can just define the license as Apache 2 and number 4. 5 is the governance structure for roles. And this is where you all would want to take a look at this and figure out, is there anything that doesn't work here? We've made it pretty high level and pretty simple in terms of the governance structure is pretty loose, to be honest with you, but it is at least defined and written down in such a way that somebody could figure out who's making decisions and how. There's contributing guidelines, and I think you already have a contributing.md file already in terms of how to make contributions, so we'd likely just port or use what you have already. And then there's a template. If you had never developed any part of the specification yet, there's a template for doing so. And then we can either use whatever code of conduct you're using, or the default one here we have here is based off of the contributor covenant. And that's really it. That's what's in there. I've included slides that talk a little bit about how to create one and the process of going through it. I can talk through these slides, but I didn't know exactly how much time we have on the agenda today. So I just want to give you a flyby overview. Maybe I'll just pause here and see what questions come up. Here, Kim, how long do I have for this? I honestly didn't know.
I don't know how long the next agenda items are, but it's fine. We can keep talking. Like, I don't know, 10, 20 more minutes. It looks like there's not too many things on the
so we're not in a rush. Okay.
I'm curious if there are other like example projects that have gone through this. I actually have two questions. That was my first question, and the other one is maybe a little bit longer, but even if you can give like a really high level overview for why projects would want to do this or become an ISO standard. I don't know if everyone kind of even has context on that, or if we can save that for another time if you don't want to dive into that piece. Just like to for folks, like giving them things to think about as we work through like something the community or the project wants to do.
Sure. I'll take your questions. I see Arno raised his hand. So yes, there are other projects using this. SPDX is one I put in as a case study in the slide deck. They did decide to go for a ISO recognition as an ISO IEC JTC1 standard. So they have an ISO number and everything else, which I think also dovetails into another part of your question, which is why would somebody want to do this? Having an ISO standard and a number allows for organizations and governments to require a specification or standard be followed in contracting for contracting purposes. It's an easy way for them to recognize and define one. There's some other issues if you don't have an international standard for organizations putting this into contracts and whatnot that, you know, I'm not going to go into right now, but the main point is it makes it easy for them to do so, especially with governments. And so this becomes something that makes it an international standard, which means any government around the world could be specifying that, you know, all, you know, contributions or all code, you know, given to our government or to our agencies or anything like that must follow, you know, XYZ standard. So that's a primary driver for why organizations want to go for the ISO standard. I would say community specifications as a development model is important because the same principles that are built into what we've done in community specification are things that are designed and have been honed for hundreds of years around standards making activities to ensure compliance with antitrust rules and regulations and make sure that it's being developed in an intellectual property appropriate way. And so, you know, we've tried to bake that into this such that it's not a burden on a community, and so that they can easily stand up a specification standard effort, whether you go for the ISO recognition or not. There's a lot built into here from a governance and licensing perspective that are important for developing a specification in the open. Kim, did I answer both your questions?
Yep,
I'm now blanking on your second one. Okay.
I'll let Arnaud go next.
Arnaud.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Mike. My question has to do with what triggers the licensing commitment. I mean, in standards organization, typically there's a very formal process of joining a working group, and that's when you become bound by the licensing commitment. What triggers this there? What's the event?
So the commitments trigger upon contribution. So you can have any number of ways that somebody would contribute to the repo. And we designed this to be a repo-based contribution model. So somebody, you know, who's participating in Salsa, you know, one of the things that you could do is just require them to add their name to a list of participants in a file on your repo to make a binding commitment. If anybody shows up and makes a pull request or, you know, submits an issue or makes a contribution in some other way in the repo, that would again bind them to the licensing commitments. So we've tried to make this as low barrier to entry as possible, but also have some way to bind somebody who's making an active contribution to the project. There is a CLA in the set of files, but the CLA is, you know, something where you don't have to go and have somebody sign it. It's a different type of contributor license agreement. It's not what you would typically see or think of when you hear the word CLA. And if I can get around all this Zoom box stuff, I can pull up the CLA right now. The CLA is based on the developer certificate of origin, which you're now requiring on each commit in your current contributing.md file. But this one would basically make it, a CLA upon contribution. And it's the same text of what you're using, what's in the DCO with some modification for it being a specification and in this repo mode. Arno, did I answer your
Thank
question?
you. Yep, absolutely. Thanks.
Okay, and Mark, I see your hand up.
Yes. So actually, I wanted to ask about the DCO. Should we continue to have that GitHub check on every commit? Like, is that really necessary? It does add actually a bit of friction that, like, we regularly get pull requests from people editing on GitHub, and then they can't do that because it didn't automatically add the signed off by, or like you have a typo in your email address or something like that. Is that still valuable, or if we switch to community specification, would that kind of obviate the need for the DCO check with signed off by?
That's a good question. Scott, what have we done in the past? Do you have?
I think we're still developing.
I don't think it would be necessary though. I mean, so it's already bound. You're already making that in the CLA. So upon contribution, you wouldn't really need the DCO check anymore. If you wanted to keep it, I don't think that'd be an issue, but it would just be duplicative. Does that help, Mark? Or is that answer?
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Yes, that helps. So, okay, so it sounds like from your perspective, we could consider removing the DCO check. So I'll start an issue we could discuss whether or not to remove it. But that's helpful. Thanks.
It's up to you all.
Any other questions for Mike or Scott? No? Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Mike, and Scott. I think the next steps are probably, like Mark, with the steering committee to discuss or create an issue for discussion for adoption, or talk to your legal counsels first too, for those that have them that want to get more information.
I'll note that I'm in favor, but my legal counsel is the presenter.
That would be awkward if your legal counsel wasn't in favor. All right, cool.
David will fly through his legal review. But I will add, if any of your legal counsel do have questions or want to discuss this a bit more, I'm more than happy to hop on a call and have a conversation about it and figure out, how we can address any questions or concerns they might have. So I don't know if my contact information is in here, but I can put it in there at the end. Scott's, I think, is your contact info here? Yeah. And I will add in real time.
You don't want people to send snail mail?
Please no snail mail. Don't use this one. Or call the main phone number. So my email address is in here as well. And we're available to answer any questions that might come up.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Kim, did you want me to stand for any of the other topics, or are we...
I think we're good unless anyone else has questions.
I see in the chat or something. Candygrams. Oh, well, that won't work either because it's just a post office mailbox, but maybe the people at the post office would appreciate it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
All right, let me share my screen
Oops.
again.
If I try to leave, it says end meeting for all, so I shouldn't do that.
Uh-oh. That's weird. Why would it end the meeting? Maybe because you were the first one here. I don't know how Zoom works still.
Did you make me a host at some point?
No.
Yeah. Let me make you the host.
You can,
right.
yeah, just assign somebody else as the host and they'll be good.
There we go. Now I can just leave. Okay. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Is my screen back up?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Okay, let's get through the next items. There's a lot of people on the call, so it would be great if we did some intros at the end if we have time. So let's get through this. So Tom is on the call and is going to do a Nix demo and maybe give some context about what Nix is, if possible. Tom, are you here?
I'm here. Can we push that one till the mid-December if possible?
Oh, this one. Yeah, sure.
All right, thanks.
Oh, next meeting. We might cancel that one if everyone's on vacay. So, but I'll flag you and figure it out.
That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, that's getting dangerously close to Christmas. And we want people to hear what you have to say.
Awesome. And next we have Dev, who's been doing lots of great work on the Salsa website. Dev, are you on the call?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone. Kim, do you mind if I grab the
Take
screen
over.
as well?
Yeah.
Thank you all. So yeah, we've been making good progress on salsa.dev. So an update to salsa.dev. I'll show you some little bits in a second. So for anybody that hasn't come across us before, we're Projects by If, we're a consultancy that are working on all sorts of projects around trusted infrastructure, various technology projects like this, and we're helping with salsa.dev. The kind of the goal of this project for us is like driving understanding and driving actionability on the website as it stands at the moment. So we're giving it a bit of an overhaul. It's a new look, but we're also adding a bunch of new content. So I'll show you. Am I sharing? What am I sharing? My whole
Everything.
screen? Can you see this? All right. That's probably really distracting. But so essentially we've been working on a few different things. New look, logo, adding all sorts of rich content, and also sort of slightly shifting some of the wording in some places. But we've also been adding a bunch of new things, which we're hoping are going to drive people a little bit more to be able to kind of get going with the thing. So particularly areas such as getting started in use cases. So you see, we've got an overview screen here, which is like intended as a high-level overview in which you can jump out to different pages. But it also kind of starts to give a sense of the kind of the credibility of the project and who else is involved, all across this industry. Get started. We're trying to put together a kind of how to reach Salsa Level 1 as quickly as possible sort of guide. So really basic steps to get this going in like an hour, or well, I mean, it's probably not an hour, but in a low effort fashion. We're also bringing in a bunch of content that has been sort of inspired or taking directly from Matsuotso's ladders concept, talking about like various different use cases and various different personas and why people would use salsa for different things at different levels. So trying to bring some of that content in as well. And then looking at a kind of a 101 page for like a home page for the specification. So, you can jump straight to the specification and get to all the pages that you need, levels, requirements, provenance, threats, versioning also, but then at the same time giving a bit of a kind of, it's not the landing page, but it's trying to accommodate slightly more technical audiences, like people that want to dig a bit further. We'll break down a detailed explanation about like, okay, what is this thing, isolating different parts of the supply chain and explaining some of the threats at a relatively high level before people can then jump down into like the specific documents that they might need and might want to run through as part of their, going through the attestation process. And just generally trying to add some visual indicators and like hooks and badges for things so that people can kind of glom on to the different levels and what they're used for and what the goals of each level might be and what the limits of each level might be also. So this is obviously, you can see that I'm playing around here with the clickable wireframe. I'm going to add a link to this, and it's going to go this evening into, we have a discussion group called Salsa-if-discuss. So it's SLSA-if-discuss. And anyone's welcome to join that. I'll drop this link in here. But what we're really aiming for is to have a version of Stag. So we have a fork of it, and we will be pushing the progress that we have made, the progress that we do have, into a place where other people can look at it as soon as possible. So hopefully tomorrow or Friday. And the aim with that will be that sort of specific feedback to do with content, to do with wording, to do with I don't understand this bit, or blah, 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 ideas that you might have. We want to manage that through issues on the fork that we have. So I will send out links to all of that on the discussion group in the next couple of days. Yeah, so if anyone's interested in diving in and sort of reading any more of this in detail, you'll be able to after I share that link in a second.
This looks awesome, Dev. You've got lots of praise in the chat channel going on if you want to check that out.
Oh, cool. I didn't see that going on. All right. Nice one.
While
Thank
you're
you.
presenting. Oh, yeah, it looks really great. I'm excited to see this go live. Does anyone have questions for Dev? Oh, yes. David calls out that he misses the goose in the salsa dress. How do we?
Oh, we have the goose. We have the goose on the community page. Sorry, I didn't click and show you that, but we've got a really nice looking community page with the goose and with media and Operation Salsa's on there and all that sort of stuff. On the
Then you pass.
There you go. There you go.
But really, it does look nice. Thank you.
Does the goose have a name yet? I feel like that's an important topic that needs to be discussed at some point.
We are hitting all the important questions of the day. I don't know of a name. I'm sorry?
Could be the salsa mascot, couldn't it? That could be the sort of.
Well, the goose is actually the OpenSSF mascot, and I have one right here.
Wow.
So.
And then the salsa one, we put a dress on it. Wow.
Spectacular art capabilities, whoever drew that. I'm amazed.
Maybe we assign that to the governing board. We can go work.
You don't want me in a dress, trust me.
No, I mean naming the goose. All right.
Okay.
Very cool. Thank you, Deb. Any other questions about the new site? No? You good? Sweet. Okay. Moving on down the list. I think we might have time for at least more intros and any other topics that folks want to chat about today. So next we have Mike Lieberman that's going to talk about project packages versus distribution packages. Do you want to screen share, Mike, or are you just going to talk and I can screen share and try to jot down some notes? Did we lose Mike?
Your audio's off, Mike.
Mike was off there. Sorry. You can hear me now, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Sorry. So yeah, the GitHub issue is, there's not a whole lot in there, but I just wanted to kind of quickly write it up before the meeting. Something sort of came up during some of the discussions with the Nix folks and some stuff that I've heard in the community around, how do we get Linux distributions and their packages to be Salsa compliant and whatnot. And I think that kind of opens up something that isn't really clarified in Salsa today, which is just like, okay, I have a good idea if I'm building a Python package or whatever, what that requires to be, what is required to be Salsa compliant. But if I have if I'm running a Linux distribution, often what ends up happening is that Linux distribution will have different patches to what is happening in the upstream. There'll be different ways to package it, right? Like there's going to have its own code that's going to define its own way of building the package and whatnot. And so wanted to start at least highlight this as something that I don't think Salsa currently really gets into, and probably we should get into. And I don't want to ruin Tom's Nix demo that he's going to be giving, at a later meeting. But as an example, right, Nix packaging, they sort of pull down the source code, they do some additional stuff to then package it up. And so you might say, well, the Nix package itself is Salsa 3 compliant, but the code that it's using upstream might not, like the code that it's using upstream where it's compiling it or otherwise using it might not be Salsa 3 compliant. So how do we sort of reconcile that? Did that make sense to folks?
So let me just kind of think. It did. Let me make a proposal. One obvious way to do this is treat them as separate, upstreams and so on, just like we do with, when you bring in a component, you can be Salsa compliant, but your upstream of one of your components that you use isn't, because otherwise there'll never be a start. You could consider, if you're doing a distribution package, the project package is the or source code often is the upstream. And then your distribution package is the one that you're talking about when you're talking about compliance. That does create some opportunity for confusion. But I mean, I guess the obvious way to me is to treat it like many other things that we treat, but that doesn't make it right.
I think maybe we should generalize this a little bit, because I think you have the same situation in situations where an organization mirrors a repo and implies their own patches.
Yep, same thing.
It's the exact same thing. You could consider your own distribution, like if company X has like the Linux kernel, for example, and then has their own patches on top of that. I don't have a good answer to it, but figuring that out and how that works, I think we do need to have an answer.
I mentioned this to Marina from Tough, and her response was that link what is it in toto link attestations or predicates were designed specifically to support this, so to provide a way for the distribution to link back to the original source that they're pulling in and patching on top of.
So maybe the way forward, and I'm not sure we'll solve it right now, but this is an important thing to settle eventually. I mean, I think at the very least, I think we can agree that if you're doing a distribution, and it could be a company internal distribution, and you want to claim Salsa compliance, at the very least, the Salsa requirements apply to the distribution. If you're creating that distribution and you're claiming it, I think we can all agree on that, right? So now the question is, how far back do you push it? I mean, at the very least, you should be able to assert, I got it from here, and here's what I got. Maybe some cryptographic hash or something of the source code, so that you can take the step back. I think that's a bare minimum. I'm hoping that we can agree on that. And then the problem is, it's going to be possibly confusing, because if I download package P from a distro, but the source package and don't comply, is that confusing? Possibly. I'm not sure how to solve that. But I think we can at least agree on that floor, and then the question is, how far do we push the floor?
David, could you restate the floor in one sentence?
If I answer no, what happens? Okay, how's this? If a distribution package maintainer claims Salsa compliance, at the least, those Salsa requirements apply to the distribution package process itself.
Yes.
I feel like I should write this down.
That was
Maybe in the
what
notes.
I think you should write it down. I think that's
All right, I'll write down the notes and let's see if I can do it the same way twice.
I think maybe a very related problem is when you have kind of basically like a multi-step build. If you look at an Alpine package, or even a Debian build, there's one build that transforms the actual source repo, like the canonical place where it's edited, into a tarball. That is one build. And then there's another build that takes that, and then that thing is checked in, and that's the official source package. And then there's another build that transforms the source package into a binary package. It's a similar problem there of like the binary package could be Salsa X, but the source package might not be. And like how transitive should it be, etc.
Right. I think that's the fundamental question: is how transitive and what's transitive. And I think we should document that.
I think there's another open issue on that too somewhere. I don't know if there's discussion on it.
Tom, you have your hand up.
Yes. So what I want to bring up is this question of, especially with the transitive, right? It would be very awkward if the upstream source, the canonical source of something, was for whatever reason Salsa 1, and then all of a sudden, with the same practices, something got jumped up to 3 or 4. And that applies in a similar way to something that already upstream is, very compliant and very much along the way. So like the level of effort it requires to like climb the ladder in one jump, right, is somewhat of an issue, because simply applying the exact same procedures and processes onto something that is like fundamentally less managed or less compliant, it's awkward. It's awkward to say, well, it's just simply because we applied the same process to both, all of a sudden now everything is compliant. So like the problems of upstream can be mitigated, but they do trickle downstream, right? But that also is not necessarily a condemnation on like downstream packaging efforts or like downstream builds. It's just a fact that like upstream might be less managed or less secure, or who knows what.
Tom, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So one thing to add on there, like I think a very specific example, and I agree largely with the transitive. We don't want to have Salsa become transitive, at least the way it's stated now. But one particular example is like two-party code review. Like if I'm the packager and my package definition has a two-party code review, does that mean it immediately becomes, it has that thing? But if the software it's pulling down doesn't have two-party code review, am I still, what is it, like Salsa 4 compliant there, right? Like I would say probably not, or at least it would be sort of, in some cases, misleading if it's not very clear that like the packaging is Salsa 4 compliant, but what it's packaging might not be, or Salsa 3 compliant or whatever. That's one particular like example that that just is in front of mind.
Do you mind if I rephrase what I think the question is? Which is that perhaps what we're asking is whether the policy is that we take the minimum of all sources or the maximum of all sources, by which I mean the minimum level of all sources or the maximum level of all sources. Because that seems to be, to me, the question at the heart of the discussion.
The derivative of the salsas as you proceed downstream.
Right, the hypergeometric, yeah, okay.
It feels like this is my day for the recursive salsa problem, because it's been cropping up in other conversations as well. And I like, if we were not talking about a source copy of this package, we were talking about a salsa compliant produced binary of foo.npm. And some aggregator aka a distro, was packaging up a bunch of things and said, I am building my distribution with foo.npm 1.2.3 and yada, 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 like that. The aggregator has a source definition which says which versions of what they're manifest, and they have produced some software, but their components inevitably will have different salsa levels and different, vulnerabilities and different issues and so forth. I don't see how we can reason about the aggregate thing without knowing its components and having an evaluation of them. It's not like we could sort of, you could say, okay, this is something. Well, Debian does a Salsa 4-level job of their aggregation work. The process they do of taking these various pieces is trustworthy. There's no tampering happening here because blah, 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 right? But the pieces themselves are still what the pieces themselves are. They're like, not to belittle their work, but they're just aggregating other people's work in some space, and it's a curation of work rather than they wrote an application or something. And I know that's sort of not really an accurate statement, but it's like, I don't see how you can get there. Like, what level would you give it? It's Salsa 1. Okay, what does that mean to me? It doesn't really answer my question, because I'm trying to decide what I care about downstream of this thing, or what I'm getting out of it, or what the risks around this thing are. And I'm going to end up looking at the S-bomb and making an evaluation of like what risks I'm taking on by picking up this distribution, this curated aggregate set of things. Does that make sense, Jacques, to your point?
Yeah, sort of. I still think it comes back to, quite selfishly, it comes back to that question of whether you can lawfully propagate either the minimum or the maximum into the higher, into the containing element. So you've got your aggregate. Sorry, Tom. Can I finish? Yeah, you've got your aggregate. It's got its subcomponents. Those subcomponents can be considered to be some Salsa level, or where those subcomponents are source code. Source code is treated as a first-class element. The things that are applied to the source code create the preconditions for a Salsa level. The problem is when we bring in multiple sources, we have to have a rule that decides which of those Salsa level prevails. Like, we can't take an average because it's a nominal scale or an ordinal scale at least, but it's not an interval or ratio scale, so we can't do anything numerical to it. We have to decide it's one or the other. We have to categorize. Tom, I'm done. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, my apologies. So we've been thinking about this for our internal system here at Google, and we've been thinking of Salsa as a building block where the level applies to each step, and then you can use that step to analyze each of the blocks. And so number one, when an artifact at like any step in the process is produced, the provenance, it includes a reference in the materials section to each of the inputs. So you know what the inputs are, and then on top of that, we are imagining that when you propagate the artifact and that provenance, that you would also then attach various additional attestations for each of those inputs that says that, hey, artifact A was evaluated at like Salsa level 1, artifact B was evaluated at Salsa level 3, etc. And that further, that sort of summary attestation would likely include the minimum level of each of its transitive dependencies. We think that to your point, the minimum level is probably the most important thing, because that tells you that there's still that really tells you what you most care about. Like, if you have 100 dependencies, if one of them is Salsa 4 and the other 99 are Salsa 0, like that shouldn't give you any confidence, right? So you really want to know what the minimum is, and then from that, you can, like, from that information, you can look at an artifact at its dependencies, see which of the dependencies have the lowest levels, and then direct your work to like go and fix those things.
Quickly, just to the Debian sort of case specifically, I don't think the transitivity applies directly for what we're thinking of Salsa provenance, because it is sort of a source-based import asynchronously from the packaging step. So I think addressing, you know, source attestations might make this conversation a bit more tractable, because then you actually have a sort of Salsa level potentially for, you know, your Debian mirror that is, you know, taking this upstream code and eventually producing a separate binary artifact with it. Yeah, but aside from that, yeah, definitely agree.
It seems like there's actually maybe two things that we're talking about here. One is how we draw the box around like what is the building block of like what gets a Salsa rating. Like, is it just the build? Is it just the source repo? Is it the build plus the source repo? Is it the build plus the source package plus the source repo plus the upstream repo? And I think that was Mike's original question. The issue of like the general Salsa, like the transitive nature of like if you pull in dependencies and having some aggregate measure of goodness, seems like it's maybe a separable problem. Like they're related, but I think it's worth thinking about those two separately. Like, what is the building block, and then how do we assemble the building block into something larger?
Yeah, Mark, you hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, don't want to go too deep into the transitive rabbit hole, because I think that there's a lot of stuff that still needs to be done on that end. But, you know, I don't want us to start saying, hey, do we need to start generating Salsa attestations for the chips we fabricate? Like, I don't want to necessarily say, hey, we need to start there, and we need to derive everything from there. It was more of, yeah, like, hey, this is a specific case here, right, where you have a specific package manager that's doing something specifically, and you're saying, like, how do we differentiate what it's doing to somebody else's source code? You know, are we saying that, hey, if you trust them, you're implicitly trusting that the source code that they're pulling from is, you know, good by them, but then you open up certain things that like can be a little unclear, like that 2-person code review. Like, yes, the package managers are doing, you know, let's say Red Hat with RPMs, like their patches are going through 2-person code review, their package builds are going through 2-person code review, but the upstream stuff they're patching might not go through 2-person code review. So does that really mean it's that? I don't know.
Well, I don't think we need to, I don't think this is really a Salsa problem. I think sort of what a level might mean to someone consuming provenance about a Debian package should model the like external distribution of the, you know, software that they're consuming. Like a Salsa level, whatever, 4 should be less meaningful. Like there should be some more maybe motivation to explore the transitive graph in that case. But I think like just, you know, having some smarts on the part of the, you know, whoever's doing the policy analysis, maybe, you know, after whatever, is fine. That need not be sort of fully solved at the Salsa level.
For this issue, I think what would maybe useful is like, I suspect there's probably a handful, like a small number of kind of models for how things work. There's a single source repo and you publish a package directory. There's an upstream repo and a distribution Git repo, and then you publish that package. There's a source package, something like that. And maybe if we, you know, enumerate them or list them as case studies, that might help us better make the decision, because we'll kind of see in practice what things look like instead of talking abstractly.
Yeah, I wrote in a proposal for text, and that doesn't mean that everyone has to agree to it, but I think there's a difference between the transitivity, where most packages have we bring in dependencies of others, which you quickly get to hundreds and hundreds, and that's all confusing. I think in this case, this is something different. It typically, for a distro, it really is that software with some tweaks. And from a point of view of information, I'd love to see both numbers. This is Salsa Level 3-on-1, and that means that the distro is 3, but it's packaging some source code that was actually Salsa 1. And that tells me right away that the Debian stuff, for example, probably is in good shape. But if I'm going to worry, I worry over here, and that gives me a little more information. And now, as soon as you say this is a package that brings in 50 other packages, we've already, I think, agreed that that's out of scope. Those are separate Salsa levels, because otherwise, get down to the chips and measure the sand and stuff.
David, when you said tweaked, what I heard was forked.
Tweak?
What you said when they pick something, because when you say they pick up this source code, right? So it's source code. There's no binary. There's no production processes. No build. So Salsa 2 is not. Is that what you're saying?
No, I didn't say that. I mean, what Debian does is they take the original one. I know a little bit about Debian's and Fedora's processes, at least. They take it, they create some patches on top, typically to make it integrate with the larger software. But they very much try to push the changes back upstream, and oftentimes the changes work on later versions without issues anyway. They tend to be small integrative changes. So
you're still using language that sounds like fork to me. Like it may be an unofficial fork or an implicit one, but they make some changes to some patches. They then push them back upstream later on, but they're basically maintaining a private version, a separate version of the original source code, and then putting into their build process to produce the artifacts for the system or whatever.
It's a patch file.
Yeah, these are typically relatively small patch files. They're not. I mean, if you want to use the generic term fork, meaning not the same, not exactly the same copy, sure.
That's what I mean.
In the same version that a Unix fork is a fork. But that doesn't mean. But
so I apologize for the terminology, but it's a different version of the software. So all of the representations about the original package that I might care about from the point of view of who maintains it, its correctness in terms of I can look at the source code or whatever, right? Sure, Jacques, a soft fork sounds good to me. The point being is, it's not what I see in foo.npm's repo. It's whatever the heck Debian chose to do with foo.npm for good reasons, and they may be ultimately going to be back up there. But at the time of the production of their output, it is a soft fork of something upstream. It is not the same thing. And in many ways, what guarantee is there that that soft fork is innocuous, minor, trivial, or otherwise innocent, right? It's entirely up to my...
To be honest, usually the risk is the other direction. Usually the problem is the Debian one is going to have a much higher Salsa level than the underlying software. Because when you have a patch that's 3 lines long in a 1,000,000-line program, you can have 50-person review. It's not hard. But the problem here is, so it would be much easier for Debian to make a Salsa, get a very high Salsa level that would be misleading to most folks.
I think we're saying the same thing though, right? Like I just don't think it's reasonable to pretend from a formalism, and remember, people aren't going to be doing evaluations, they're going to be looking at numbers in the long term, that foo.npm as maintained by Debian is anything except like a pile of source code that Debian has patched in some way. And then Debian produces, as you said, like their own production process around it that is better and more secure. I agree with you that we need to have an understanding of the provenance. Like this source code came from that source code or whatever. I don't know, it just feels like we're sort of trying to, as what Mark and I think others said, of like, trying to apply a component level analysis at the Salsa thing to a compositional level problem that is different.
I think the problem here is that if you measure just the Debian package, they may be a Salsa 4 right away, instantly. And that's probably more misleading.
But if you look at the life cycle of the source code that is the Debian package, and you say, has every line of source code here been reviewed by 2 people in this organization? The answer will be no, because they picked up a pile of source code from
okay.
the
All right.
originators.
In that case, you can never ever have source code acceptable at any Salsa level, since therefore you see what I'm saying?
So maybe if I could jump in, I think
Sure.
the issue is that so as I understand, Debian has a Git mirror of the code where like the original main line is in one branch, and then they have their patches in another branch, and they kind of merge it in, and then they build from that. So there's some process that imports from the upstream into their mirror, I'll call it. And that import process, I think, is, I think we have another open issue about this of like, how do we handle cases like that where we have bulk import of code or files into the repo, and we want to make sure that that really did come from the upstream. But it seems like a kind of a similar thing, right?
If they're doing that, that's a change from their historical process. Granted, I haven't delved into Debian, but at least historically, both Debian and Fedora, they would copy the tarballs, and then all changes would be clearly separate and separable.
Oh, sorry, I might be. You're more likely to be correct than I am.
Well, whether they're using Git or whether they have a copy or whether they, how they do it, doesn't matter. The point is, as Mark said, there's a bulk import of source code that is unlikely to be going through the level of change review that we would expect of a normally maintained package. They're saying whatever those folks upstream did, that's what we're taking. And then here is our curated set of patches, effectively, and configuration on top of that to create our thing. And, David, to your point, I don't think it's reasonable to have a Salsa representation of a Debian output that doesn't acknowledge the fact that a large chunk of what Debian did is a modification, a patch to a mod, a curation of some upstream stuff. And if you don't look at the upstream stuff, you're not going to get the full picture.
Right. No, we're totally agreeing there. The issue is how we deal with it, not we both agree there's a problem. The question is, how do we deal with this? I mean, another way is really take a systems view. Whereas basically it's from the point of view of Salsa, it's not the Debian packagers and it's not the upstream, it's the combination. And view them as if they were a single organization that just happens to have different groups working on different things.
At which point,
okay, I'm going to jump in because we have a minute left.
Yeah, I think this is going to be challenging.
Sorry we didn't get through everyone with hands raised. I think the best thing to do is just have the discussion on the issue. Maybe David, you can copy what you wrote here over there. And next time we'll try to do intros first for folks on the call that want to introduce themselves. So cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.